and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out on this balmy, lovely October day to hear about fire and fury, US foreign policy in the Trump era. Fire and fury, that's rather terrifying. Anyway, so my name is Elaine Monaghan. I'm a professor of practice in journalism and public relations over at the Media School here at IU. And you may wonder what on earth I'm doing moderating this panel with some reason. However, the reason is that I covered the State Department for Reuters for several years and travelled around with 2 secretaries of state. So I am an expert in nothing and know a little bit about everything, and therefore I am the perfect moderator. Anyway, I'm going to introduce our fabulous panelists in this order. And it goes without saying that they are all very highly qualified people with terrifying letters after their name. However, I am going to refer to them by their first names, with apologies in advance. Anyway, let's start in the corner with my media school colleague, Emily Metzger. Emily is going to talk to us about President Trump and Asia. And she is a former US diplomat, a policy analyst and opinion writer, and an associate professor and director of the honours programme at the Media School. She is also an affiliated faculty member here at SGIS. Her research focuses on public diplomacy, international communication, and the role of media in society, and her work has appeared in too many academic publications to name. Her first book just came out this year about the impact of the JET programme on the US-Japan relationship, and her next project is going to focus on policy and politics of US information diplomacy since World War II, with the tentative title, The American Narrative. Sitting to Emily's right is my friend, Mr. Ambassador, also known as Faisal Amin Rasool Al-Istrabadi. Did I say that right? Thank you. He is the founding director of the Centre for the Study of the Middle East, right here, and he is also a professor of practice at the Maurer School of Law and SGIS. From 2004 to 2010, he represented Iraq at the United Nations and was a legal advisor to the Iraqi foreign minister during the negotiations for UN Security Council Resolution 1546, which I can't remember the full title of, but there we go. Anyway, he was the principal legal drafter of Iraq's interim constitution. His book, The Future of ISIS, Regional and International Implications, edited with his neighbour, Shumeet Ganguly, is scheduled for publication in November.
Turns out it's actually June now.
Oh, sorry, June.
We just found out today.
Following the very good principle of all the best books coming out later than advertised. Ambassador Istrabadi is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is going to talk to us about the JCPOA, which an acronym he promises not to use, which actually, of course, as you know, is the Iran deal. He will also talk about Israel-Palestine a little bit, he promises, and Iraq, needless to say. To his right is Professor Shumeet Ganguly, who is a professor of political science, who holds the Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations, and he's been on IU's faculty since 2003. He also holds a position at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and, like his neighbour, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has been named a distinguished alumnus of Berea College, and has a medal from the Italian Chamber of Deputies, which I find intriguing and want to hear more about later. He also has an award from the President of India. This semester he has been a visiting professor at the Strategic Studies Institute of the US Army War College. His area of expertise, of course, is on the contemporary politics of South Asia, and he is going to talk to us about what he terms a lack of appropriate appointments in various bureaus dealing with South Asia. Surprise, surprise. And the decision to send more troops to Afghanistan. And as well, of course, he will talk about Pakistan, needless to say. And finally, to my left is Dina Speckler, who comes to us also from political science, where she is also a professor. And Dina is going to talk to us about a lack of a Trump administration policy towards Russia, which is sort of surprising since that's all we ever hear about. But that's what she's going to tell us about, the lack of it. Her research interests are in comparative foreign policy and international relations, especially Russian, Soviet and American foreign policy, and the international relations of the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. Her current research deals with the explanation of major foreign policy change and with Russia's policy towards its near abroad. She's completing work on a collaborative study of rural development in Tajikistan, for which I think she deserves a medal. Anyway, Ina, thank you very much for joining us, all of you. So the format will be that we will hear from our speakers for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have lots of time for questions, I hope. Emily, take us away.
Well, thank you, Faisal, and to the Institute, the Center, for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. It used to be said that politics stopped at the water's edge, but that's demonstrably untrue in the age of President Trump. Although, to be fair, many parties are responsible for the repeated crossing of that Rubicon. Other parties in the White House, in the administration, on the Hill, in the media. There's a lot of politicking going on, and the stakes are really pretty high. And nowhere is this truer than in Asia. The administration's policy toward the region has been muddled. Chocolate cake with the prime minister, condemning China, threatening to recognize Taiwan, then affirming the cross-strait status quo, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Twitter harassment of a young, unpredictable, and nuke-bearing authoritarian. The list goes on, and many argue the approach has been so confused, at least in part, because huge swaths of the Republican national security establishment condemned Trump the candidate and have been shut out of serving Trump the president. For all the ink and tweets spilled, there's clearly no articulated policy toward the region, although North Korea, terrorism, and trade seem to have been the focus to date. The outlines of a policy may appear soon, however. The president is due to take his longest yet trip overseas to Asia. Next week, he's headed to Japan, South Korea, China, Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And as one observer wrote, a little over 8 months into the Trump presidency, things could be worse for the United States in Asia. As another analyst noted, this trip is historic in its combination of low expectations and high potential impact. So after beginning with a briefing at PACCOM in Hawaii, President Trump will travel to Japan to meet with U.S. and Japanese service members, visit with Japanese citizens whose family members have been abducted by North Korea, and to participate in a bilateral meeting with the just electorally reinforced Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He then heads to South Korea for similar meetings with American and South Korean military forces, a bilateral with President Moon Jae-in, in a speech at the National Assembly marking the strength of the bilateral relationship, although concerns are emerging about its strength given President Trump's criticisms of Moon for being weaker on North Korea than his recently impeached predecessor, and Trump's suggestion that South Korea may actually be asked to bear more financial responsibility for the American deployment of the terminal high altitude area defense system on the ground there. On the trade front, President Trump will no doubt highlight the need for broad international support for pressuring North Korea to drop its missile development program. He then goes to China, where of course there's nothing at stake. He'll meet with President Xi Jinping, who just further consolidated his power, having had his political thought entered into the pantheon of modern Chinese political thought. He spoke at the National Congress about a strong and invigorated Chinese Communist Party, and notably did not identify an heir apparent. He's now widely seen as the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, and the prospect of his continued rule beyond the end of his second 6-year term in 2022 is now something that people are beginning to whisper about, given that there is in fact no identified successor. President Xi certainly remains committed to restoring China's rightful place in the world. In Vietnam, President Trump will attend the APEC Economic Leaders Forum in Da Nang and make a speech to the APEC CEO Summit, where he's expected to emphasize the United States' goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, as well as the region's importance to the American economy. He'll also go to Hanoi for meetings with Vietnamese President Tran Dai Quang and other Vietnamese officials. He then heads to the Philippines for a 50th anniversary celebration of ASEAN and a 40th anniversary celebration of the United States' formal relationship with ASEAN. And here the president is going to need to convey a pro-trade view in spite of American withdrawal from TPP. And it's worth noting that China, traditionally the power against which ASEAN was existed to balance against, has been offering its own economic incentives for better relations with parties across the Southeast Asian region. And China's doing this in much the same way that it's been reaching out to Central Asia and elsewhere with incentives related to the One Belt, One Road project. While in the Philippines, President Trump is also expected to meet with Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte and other Filipino leaders. These days, Indo-Pacific is almost synonymous with Flashpoint and in the foreign policy context. And it seems this trip is designed with an eye toward ally reassurance, relationship building, counterbalancing of a rising power, and reassurance that the U.S. will continue to be a force in the region, no matter the optics of American domestic politics as they play out more than half a world away. The issues with which the Trump administration must contend in the region include China's continued rise, North Korea's continued antagonizing of a White House that seems ever willing to be provoked, Japan's contemplation of giving its self-defense force authorities that resemble more of a traditional military and are likely to trigger historic animosities lingering in the region, continued growth of transnational threats in the region from drug trafficking to human trafficking to corruption to terrorism, and repercussions, economic and otherwise, from the U.S. withdrawal from TPP. Low expectations may well work in President Trump's favor as he travels across the region. Incremental progress on 3 fronts might be seen as signaling some success. Modest progress in reassuring allies and nurturing relationships that still have a distance to go, ensuring them of the Americans' commitment to the region. Credible presentation of viable economic alternatives to TPP and the Chinese economic rise, and delivery of more than talking points on transnational issues, chief among them counterterrorism and efforts to curb drug trafficking and human trafficking. The Obama administration once spoke of pivoting to Asia, but that foreign policy reorientation never really developed. And today the Trump administration is faced with a bevy of issues across the region, many of which have festered over time as a result of inattention from both Democratic and Republican administrations. The stakes are high, expectations are low, and we're left hoping for the best. As Defense Secretary Mattis said earlier this year at an Asian Security Summit, bear with us. Once we have exhausted all possible alternatives, Americans will do the right thing. So stay tuned.
So that's an uncredited tip of the hat to Winston Churchill, right?
Indeed, yes, paraphrase.
After exhausting all the possibilities, Americans do the right thing in the end. Let me just speak for a moment as the director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East. Thank you all for being here, and to thank in particular my colleagues, and especially Professor Monahan for chairing us this afternoon. I am going to try to, we could take, as is the case with each of us here, we could probably take each of our subheadings and spend the entire hour and a half, each one of us, on each one of our subheadings. So I'm going to do a very quick tour of some of the issues that I think are central to the Middle East. I think you're going to hear, I suspect, from all of us, and I'll be happy to be disagreed with by anybody who thinks I'm wrong on this, but I think we will hear from each of us in respect to each of the various parts of the world we're talking about that 10 months almost into the new administration, there is still no identifiable direction in Middle East policy on the part of this administration. I don't know about my colleagues, but for me at least, I can say there's nothing new in that. U.S. policy has been relatively incoherent in the Middle East for far longer, I think, than the last almost 9 years. But my reference point for most of my remarks will be sort of the previous administration versus this one, for obvious reasons. I'm not trying to give a history lesson here on the history of the U.S.-Middle East relations. You have a sense that the person who wins the day with this administration is the one that got to speak to the president last. And that's a bit of a problem. And the example for that, at least that seems to be true in the early days of the administration, at least before General Kelly imposed some limitations on the West Wing. He obviously can't impose limitations on the residents, but he did impose some limitations on the West Wing. And the sort of the example of all of that, the par excellence in Middle Eastern politics so far, is the kerfuffle with Qatar. The president's trip to Saudi Arabia, I don't know if you all saw the very odd picture. I actually used it at a talk I gave here at Mini University in the summer, and people thought it was photoshopped. It isn't. There's a terrorism center that was opened in Saudi Arabia, and there's an orb of some sort, a lighted orb. And there is the King of Saudi Arabia, the President of the United States, and the President of Egypt sort of touching it like this. It looks like it should be a scene out of, I don't know, you know, something by J.R.R. Tolkien or something. At that meeting, when we took that sort of, when that photograph was taken, at that summit on terrorism, the president praised Qatar as a U.S. ally in the fight against terrorism. Well, it wasn't a couple of weeks later before the President of the United States sided with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, who imposed a sort of comprehensive set of sanctions on Qatar for being for promoting terrorism by being too close to Iran. That, I think, is a shorthand for the incoherence of U.S. policy, of the particular incoherence of U.S. policy in the Middle East right now, and represented, in my view, by the way, at least a short-term, if not a strategic victory for Iran, because it split the Gulf Cooperation Council wide open for all to see, with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE on one side, Qatar on the other side, Kuwait and Oman staying neutral. It also drove Turkey into the receiving arms of Qatar. Turkey also has a base there. Remember, the largest U.S. base in the Middle East is in Qatar. And here was the President of the United States tweeting about how Qatar has been a problem in the war against terror, when literally 2-3 weeks earlier he had praised it as an ally. Similarly, in the case of Israel and Palestine, there was, you will recall, I hope, although it seems like a very long time ago now, I am in Twitter fatigue, that with some fanfare, the president announced that his son-in-law, 32-year-old real estate developer from Manhattan, would be taking over as the deal maker. And this is the problem, and with all respect to our students here, there are too many damn 30-year-olds running things. There's a 32-year-old first son-in-law, there's a 32-year-old, a 31-year-old actually, crown prince in Saudi Arabia, who's actually ruling in Saudi Arabia, and the sort of strategic vision of these young men seems somewhat lacking. But in any event, Mr. Kushner was supposed to be the U.S. negotiator who would bring us Middle East peace. Trump himself said, while meeting in a press conference with President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, and I'm quoting now, this is from The Atlantic, by the way, "We want to create peace between Israel and the Palestinians. We will get it done. We will be working so hard to get it done. I think there's a very good chance, and I think we will." The Atlantic notes, at a lunch later on, he was even bolder. Quote, "It is something that I think is frankly maybe not as difficult as people have thought over the years." That's more or less the last utterance of the president about a peace deal. You don't even hear about a peace process moving forward, which raises another issue, which is that there are structural problems, and I know that Professor Ganguly will talk about this as well. I have to admit here I cribbed your notes from going back and forth between us. But the lack of State Department expertise of appointed, the second and third rung bureaucrats who are really important. The lack of those appointments being made is telling, and is contributing to some of this incoherence and some of this lack of sustained diplomacy, a lack of coherence. Again, there are people who are filling positions in. They technically have authority, but they're holdovers, and a lot of the holdovers have left, by the way. So you don't even have the first echelon of holdovers. You have lower level people holding positions temporarily that they had not actually held under the previous administration, and that is. So even though they technically have the authority, everybody knows they don't actually have the ear of anyone that matters. And that has a really deleterious impact on, people aren't stupid. They read the New York Times, the Washington Post, they watch CNN. They know what's happening here. And they do have Twitter feeds there too. So they know what's going on, and it has a real effect on American diplomacy and therefore on advancing American interests overseas. Still, there have been some continuities and discontinuities, and that's where I will like to go next with 3 examples, as Professor Monahan, as Elaine said, I will discuss. And that's first on Iran. And I actually count what the President did in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as actually a continuity. If you look at it with the previous administration, if you look at it superficially, yes, he said this is not in the American interest, moving forward with the JCPOA, the worst deal ever negotiated. Well, true, but on the other hand, his action did not in fact decertify Iran. He punted to Congress, which is an atrocious thing for the executive to do. We expect the administration, the executive authority, to make foreign policy, not punt a central pillar of Middle Eastern foreign policy to Congress. Nonetheless, he punted to Congress, and there seems to me, I'll be happy to be corrected, but there seems to me to be no appetite in Congress whatsoever to rip up the deal with Iran. Today, today I was reading, he may have said it yesterday, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, said, well, it's a terrible deal, but it's better than if we withdraw from it. So, however obnoxious the sort of rhetoric about the Iran agreement may have been, it seems to me, for the moment at least, for the next every 3 months we get a report from the President, so for the next 3 months at least, it may become more significant, the sort of antipathy towards the agreement with Iran, but at the moment, at least, there's no practical, the status quo practically remains. Different is congressional action. Yesterday, the House passed by a vote of 423 to 2 a set of new sanctions relating to Iran's ballistic missile program. Ballistic missile program is not a part of the JCPOA. There is nothing in international law that bars Iran from developing a ballistic missile capability. It is not a part of the legal obligations imposed by the Security Council or by the joint JCPOA. At most, in an appendix to the UN Security Council resolution, the appendix calls upon Iran not to do things like develop a ballistic missile program, but calling upon is hardly the same as imposing a duty upon. So that's a matter of what the U.S. can do, presumably with its allies, if the allies come along. By the way, on the JCPOA itself, if the U.S. ever does decertify, it will walk that bridge alone. None of America's allies, in my view, will come along. And they will certainly not reimpose sanctions, and neither will the Security Council, because at the very least Russia and China will see to that. So I think Where I do, however, see a significant discount, by the way, I think you would have had the same sanctions resolution come out of the House if Obama or Clinton had been president. Question is, would they have vetoed it? I doubt it, because I think it's very popular to impose more sanctions on Iran in certain quarters. So I don't really even see that as being an action taken, assuming the Senate passes it and it gets to the president's desk. I don't see that as being particularly different from where policy might have been headed anyway. The apparent, well, so far rhetorical willingness to take Iran on is new. I think the previous administration, the Trump administration, had reconciled itself to an Iranian sphere of influence in the Middle East. The president said as much in Jeffrey Goldberg interview, in the, I think that was also the Atlantic, in which he said that Saudi Arabia was going to have to learn to share the Middle East with Iran. I don't know what else that could possibly mean, if not that the Iranians are entitled to their own sphere of influence. Now, I don't think that's because Obama, the secret Muslim, Hussein, after all, is an important Shi'i figure in the history of Islam. I don't think that's the reason that Obama made that declaration. I think what he was giving utterance to is the reality that the United States, neither the public nor, in my view, Congress, have the inclination or the willingness to invest in genuinely pushing Iran back. That's going to take some doing. That will take some heavy lifting. Now, maybe now with the new administration, maybe that will change, but so far it's been rhetorical. In fact, at least one rhetorical change in Iran's favor since Trump was inaugurated is that we no longer say that the government in Syria has to change, that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has to go.
No, we do.
That changed this morning.
Oh, did it? I haven't seen the news today. Oh, well, that's just a Secretary of State.
Oh.
That doesn't mean anything. Wait to see what the tweets are going to be. That has, in fact, you can say that, and I will admit to having watched absolutely no news today. You can say that. However, that's after allowing the Syrian regime to take territory back. So you can say rhetorically they need to go, but you've spent the last 10 months making sure they stay. So that just tells you one more bit of incoherence. So long as Russia and Iran are engaged, and Hezbollah are engaged in Syria, I don't see any appetite for sending U.S. troops to dislodge Dr. Assad, I should say. You will recall he's an ophthalmologist. One thing no one is contemplating, in my view, in this effort to push back on Iran is, what's Iran going to do? It's not going to sit back and do nothing. And it can push back in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in UAE, and in other places. But I don't have time to get into all of that. I'm going to end with Iraq. I have, I think, said more or less everything I want to say about Israel and Palestine, except I do want to say this simply because I want to hear myself say it. And that is that we have now the least informed U.S. ambassador to Israel in Israel's history. We have Donald Trump's personal lawyer there. And I know this from people who have been trying to deal with him on commercial issues that involve sort of commerce and politics. And that's their judgment. It's an unfortunate and I would say dangerous development. I think U.S. policy here is in continuity with the Obama administration, by the way, which is do nothing. Obama tried. As soon as it got hard, he dropped it. The Israeli polity, and I've said this before in this room in different contexts, the Israeli polity, in my view, is convinced it can maintain the occupation of the status quo ad infinitum and keeps re-electing a prime minister who is intent on doing just that. And that's where U.S. policy has been and will continue to be. In Iraq, I do want to talk about this because of the referendum on independence and the actions of the government of Iraq, which is allied with the United States, is undertaking there to retake territory. There's been much made about the Iranian role. Much of it, in my view, has been exaggerated. But the notion that the Trump administration did not recognize the referendum would be absolutely have been consistent under Obama, in my view. The priority for the United States was before and is now fighting ISIL and making sure ISIL doesn't arise again, and any kerfuffle on drawing another international boundary in the Middle East is bound to have ramifications in that respect. Pushing Iran back, as Tillerson has been saying, and I don't believe Tillerson represents U.S. policy. He has, remember when he was trying to negotiate, then the president told him he's wasting his time. So Tillerson talks, but it's the tweets that count. That's where policy comes from, because that's coming from the president. We'll see. What Tillerson gives today, the good Lord can take back tomorrow. But we'll see. In any event, one of the things the Trump administration, I want to end with this, has been doing well in the Middle East, has been working out a rapprochement between Iraq and its Arab neighbors, principally Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. If the U.S. is serious about pushing Iran back, let's say diplomatically, creating space between Iraq and Iran will be a principal pillar in that. I think the Prime Minister of Iraq is ready to move in that direction. The one thing he doesn't want is for Iraq to become the grass upon which the elephants fight anymore between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the United States or whoever else it is. So I think that I've probably got on more than my time, so I will end right there.
I have to interject for 1 second in my fact-checking capacity to prove that the orb photograph does in fact exist. And this is, I believe, Angela Merkel reacting to the orb photograph, but now I can't find that one. Sorry, hang on. No, here it is. I've got it. There she is. Please.
How apt.
Carry on.
Be sure. I think that was the setting.
No, it was a different one.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a joke, just in case you were wondering.
The first part isn't, though. That
No,
is
no,
a genuine...
the orb is real and then the Merkel photo is real. It's just in a different context.
Right.
Please carry on.
Well, we have a good thing going here. There seems to be a leitmotif of incoherence that seems to cut across various regions of the world. So why should I disappoint you when it comes to South Asia, where nearly a fifth of humanity resides? The policy has been utterly incoherent, starting with a phone call to the now deposed Prime Minister of Pakistan, where the President Trump said, "I look forward to seeing your excellent country, the remarkable progress that you have made on various fronts," and various other superlatives, which left the poor Prime Minister utterly baffled, and of course with real concerns in New Delhi about whether or not this was going to lead to another embrace of Pakistan yet again, because India and Pakistan have been at odds for only about 70 years and have fought 4 wars. But as I pointed out in an op-ed at the time, that one should not take these statements overly seriously, even though they were being analyzed at considerable length in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi, that this too shall pass, and that it did not represent American policy towards the region because it hadn't been formulated as yet. So the President's rather florid remarks should not be taken as an indicator of policy. Sadly, I've been proven entirely right. It's one of these occasions when you do wish you were wrong, despite the hyperbolic nature of those remarks. This is where we stand in terms of South Asia. Let me start with the institutional apparatus to deal with the region. There is indeed a senior director for South Asia, whom I happen to know fairly well, if I may be so self-referential, a graduate of Indiana University, no less, who actually knows something about the region, which is quite remarkable. That he actually chose Lisa Curtis to be the senior director for South Asia, even though she happens to share many of his ideological predilections. She is not innocent in terms of her knowledge of South Asia, having been a senior analyst at the CIA for many years before going to the Heritage Foundation and having a stint at the US State Department as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for South Asia. So at least in the Security Council, you have someone who does know the difference between Pakistan and Portugal, other than the fact they both start with P. Second, moving to the State Department, there is no Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia. The person is an acting senior Foreign Service officer. She is extremely able, but she is essentially an interim person, because this is typically not given to a career Foreign Service officer. Typically, this is a political appointee. That has not been the case, and she is thereby running this on an interim basis, even though it's not entirely clear that despite her competence, that she actually wields any authority. Any decisions on South Asia are really made by General McMaster, the National Security, the Director of the National Security Council, and Lisa Curtis, the Senior Director for South Asia. In addition to her job, Alice Wells, who is the Assistant Secretary, the Interim Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia, is also the interim senior, representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. This was a position that had been created under the previous administration to deal with the whole Afghanistan issue. And it is entirely possible that this position may be abolished. And Tillerson has actually suggested that there are too many special representatives dealing with too many regions of the world, and I don't know what they do, so I think I'll eliminate these positions. In the meanwhile, he has someone in both jobs. Even though has not been formally appointed, she is merely sort of in a kind of in an interim position. One would have thought that by now we would have an ambassador to Afghanistan. We do not. A country of no great significance. The mere fact that we have spent over $1 trillion over the past decade in that country is of no consequence. And that we have close to 15,000 American troops stationed there fighting a rather protracted counterinsurgency operation. But there is no ambassador to Afghanistan and no prospect of one being appointed anytime soon. There is finally, as of this morning, the possibility of an ambassador to India. Kenneth Juster, a long-time political operative in Washington in the Republican Party, senior Commerce Department official, and also on the President's Economic Council. Since the President was unhappy with the advice he was tendering, he's being sent to India as ambassador, and he just cleared the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's confirmation process, but he has yet to be confirmed by the entire Senate. I suspect that since this is not a terribly partisan matter, that the confirmation will be forthcoming. But we are almost, 9 months into the administration now, and a country with about 1.3 billion people and now a few more still doesn't have an ambassador. You would have thought that there would be a certain concentration of mind given the sheer significance of the country to American foreign policy interests in a range of areas, everything from global climate change to international trade and matters in between. What about policy shifts and continuities? Since Faisal has talked about shifts and continuities, following that same theme, I'll talk about the three principal countries in the region, because the others don't even exist as far as the president is concerned. Because I think geography is not a course that he took during his Ivy League education, amongst many other things, despite the fact that he claims he's extremely intelligent, something he reminded us of just last week.
But he's never claimed to be well informed.
That's true. He has not made that claim. But, you know, there is a wonderful song that comes to mind, actually. I'll think of the lyrics in a moment, which applies to him. It's a country and western song, which I should have played actually in preparation for this talk, because it's so apt. Let's turn to Afghanistan, a country of no trivial significance. He had initially stated that he would withdraw all troops from Afghanistan because President Obama had actually augmented troops to Afghanistan. And if President Obama had augmented troops, then certainly he would have to do precisely the opposite, to have a negative number of troops there. But on the advice of General McMaster, he has actually added 3,000 additional troops in Afghanistan. And is following a strategy which is not dissimilar to what Vice President Biden had suggested in the last days of the Obama administration, that the focus really should be on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and we should move away from everything else. And that's essentially, to the extent that one can discern a coherent strategy, that is what one can discern. And in considerable part, this is the work not of the president, but General McMaster, whom he thinks talks too much. He has said this on a number of occasions, because McMaster has been forced to correct the president when it has come to certain facts about the world. But then facts shouldn't get in the way of beliefs. There is also a distinct shift away from what is mistakenly termed, and not just by the president, by any number of people who should know better, nation building. We were never engaged in nation building. We don't construct nations. Nations organically grow. Any political scientist will tell you that. Nations are the product of history, of culture, of circumstances. What we were engaged in isn't state construction. We were trying to create a state in Afghanistan with functioning institutions. We failed miserably in that endeavor, but that's another story. But there is a shift away from state construction, and the US is not going to be in the business of providing substantial amounts of foreign assistance to Afghanistan with the purpose of bolstering various ministries, building up human resources, human capacity in Afghanistan, which had been the strategy of the previous two administrations, both Republican and Democrat. And instead, there is an attempt now to get India, the regional power, to take on that task. That India will provide increased foreign assistance. It is already the 5th largest donor to Afghanistan. According to General McChrystal, its foreign assistance program has been the most effective. It has rebuilt much of Afghanistan's power grid. It has constructed major highways. It has built roads. It has built a completely new parliament for Afghanistan, hospitals in Kabul, and consequently the Indians have a substantial infrastructural role in Afghanistan. And this is what Trump wants India to expand. There are certain regional consequences that flow from that, and I'll talk about those in a moment. There is, at least in principle, growing pressure on Pakistan, but then this was said by Tillerson, so I don't know if it means anything, in Islamabad earlier in the week. He said that Pakistan needs to end all its support to any terror group, most notably the Haqqani network, which has been wreaking havoc against American troops in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, there are certain realities of geography and politics that constrain us quite significantly. because we are acutely dependent on supplying the 15,000 troops in Afghanistan through Pakistan, since Pakistan lies athwart Afghanistan. And there is an alternative supply route, but that is completely anathema to this administration. That would be through Iran. If we had a decent working relationship with Iran, they would be more than happy to cooperate with us. And in fact, after 9/11, Iran did cooperate with the United States to provide intelligence on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, since they had no love for either organization. But the way American policy has unfolded, not only under this administration, but under the previous administration, the prospect of using Iran as a possible conduit to Afghanistan is simply not in the cards, even though there is a very nice roadway that has actually been built by the Indians all the way from Dilaram to a place called Zaranj on the Afghanistan border, which we could very easily use to supply our troops. We could use the northern route, but then we have a problem with the Russians. And also it would be much more expensive supplying through the northern route. There is a final option, that is the air route, but that is prohibitively expensive when we are talking about supplying 15,000 troops and several hundred people in the American embassy in Kabul. Finally, in terms of India, there is considerable policy continuity. Tillerson was in New Delhi just as of yesterday. He has made all the right noises and talked about expanding India's footprint in Afghanistan. There is considerable talk about a quadrilateral involving India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. This quadrilateral, in case you were wondering, is directed against a certain country north of India. It's called the People's Republic of China. There is growing concern, and a concern that goes back to the Obama administration after President Obama got mugged in Beijing and came to the realization that Beijing was not going to emerge as a strategic partner, but was really a strategic competitor, the panda huggers in this country notwithstanding. There has been a remarkable policy continuity in that regard. And Trump, of course, made a series of intemperate statements during the campaign. Those aside, there is basically the same concerns, the same misgivings that the Obama administration had about the rise and the assertiveness of China and the future of Chinese behavior in Asia. And India is seen as a sort of the linchpin of that strategy, along with Japan and Australia. And the problem is, with that strategy, while the Australians and the Japanese are mostly on board, in India there is deeply divided counsel that the Indian foreign policy establishment has not quite made up its mind whether or not it wants to be part of this quadrilateral strategic partnership. But that is clearly one of the principal goals of the administration, and there's a remarkable continuity in terms of what the Obama administration had begun and is being continued now under this administration. Apart from this, there is, of course, considerable interest in the Indian market. There's a burgeoning domestic market in India for American goods and services. Greater Indian openness is sought on trade. Again, this is not something peculiar to Trump. This was something that administrations going as far back as the George W. Bush administration had sought. And there is, again, a thread that runs through all three administrations in this regard. But the principal concern with India is going to be twofold. One, to get it to play a more expanded role in Afghanistan, and eventually to cajole, persuade, nudge India to join this quadrilateral involving Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, largely to, if not contain, but certainly balance the rise of China in Asia. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Dina, how is it looking in your part of the world?
Well, President Trump has inherited a major challenge with regard to Russia. To understand it, we actually need to go back to the beginning of his predecessor's first term in office. Essentially, since 2008, Russia has been pursuing a highly assertive policy aimed at countering what it perceives to be a serious and growing threat from NATO. NATO's substantial eastward expansion in the decade and a half after the fall of the Soviet Union was regarded by Moscow as aimed at weakening Russia, depriving it of its traditional vital sphere of influence, and therefore highly dangerous. In the aftermath of the Soviet collapse and the extraordinary economic chaos and depression that followed in Russia, its armed forces were severely weakened. They were in fact described in some sources as being on life support, with commanders and troops going unpaid, draft evasion rampant, severe shortages of everything from fuel to uniforms to ammunition to spare parts. And to many in Russia, it seemed that the West was ruthlessly exploiting this situation, taking advantage of Russia's weakness to enlarge the power and presence of a hostile Atlantic alliance. The invasion by Russia of Georgia in 2008 was aimed at rallying Russian forces and halting this perceived expansionist drive. The invasion was successful. NATO failed to support the Georgians, although NATO trainers were present in Georgia, and all talk of NATO membership for this small country in the Caucasus abruptly ended. However, Russia's forces and equipment performed very badly on the battlefield, succeeding only because they faced a far weaker opponent. And this mediocre performance triggered a major military modernization campaign, initiated in 2010 and given particular impetus after Vladimir Putin returned for a second stint as president 2 years later. The campaign has been accompanied by a sweeping military reorganization, emphasizing the role of special forces and air transport to provide a rapid reaction capability. The results of this program were first on display when Russia moved into the Crimea in 2014 in a lightning operation that was largely over in 24 hours. President Putin, as you all know, followed this operation with the movement of tens of thousands of Russian troops up to and across the border of Ukraine in support of pro-Russian separatists. And this activity, of course, constituted a clear violation both of international law outlawing such aggression, as well as of a formal agreement the Russians had made to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, these dramatic steps were motivated by the perception that Ukraine was moving closer to the West under new anti-Russian leadership, and the belief that EU and NATO membership for Ukraine might well follow. At the same time, Russia began to assume a much more aggressive stance in the Baltics, repeatedly challenging NATO air and sea forces in the region. So when President Obama came to office in 2008, he famously attempted to deal with this growing confrontation between Russia and the West by proposing a reset in U.S.-Russian relations. This policy bore fruit for a while, with a major nuclear arms control agreement and cooperation between Russia and the West in arranging far-reaching Security Council sanctions at that time on Iran's ballistic missile program. However, once Putin returned to the Russian presidency in 2012 after a 4-year hiatus, reset made little headway, and it was shattered by Russia's Ukrainian operation 2 years later. Obama worked closely with America's European partners to impose a substantial sanctions regime on Russia and sent American forces to strengthen NATO deployments in the Middle East. In Eastern Europe. Okay. This move only further antagonized the Russians and encouraged them to continue to build up and deploy Russian military power on Russia's borders with Eastern Europe. Okay. Meanwhile, Moscow has put the results of its force modernization campaign in vivid display in Syria, since Russia intervened militarily in 2015 to support Syrian President Assad in his effort to crush all opposition to his rule. At the same time, Russia has been conducting a sweeping campaign of electronic hacking, propaganda, and exploitation of social media aimed at destabilizing Western democracies and manipulating their elections to put in power leaders sympathetic to Moscow. And the U.S., of course, has been among the countries targeted, perhaps the one most affected by this campaign. So this was the situation confronting candidate Trump as he began to formulate a Russia policy, both before and after his nomination in 2016. The challenge he faced was how to deal with a government that regards the United States as a mortal foe and is rapidly enhancing its ability to threaten American allies, project its power into regions in which the U.S. has important interests and commitments, and compromise the integrity of American political institutions and processes. What do you do? It's doubtful whether candidate Trump understood and accepted the reality and significance of this challenge. But either way, whether he did or didn't, he clearly sought to conciliate Moscow. He never referred to another reset in relations with Russia. That, after all, was not only an Obama policy, it was a failed Obama policy. However, Mr. Trump made it clear that he was enormously enamored of Russian President Putin and Putin's leadership style. The Republican nominee was prepared to accept and even defend, as he did, Putin's actions. Candidate Donald seemed to be convinced that he and Vladimir could work together to resolve all issues dividing the two countries. And in fact, candidate Trump said as much. He suggested that he was prepared to accommodate Russia's most far-reaching aspirations, starting with the lifting of the sanctions that the U.S. had imposed on Russia in conjunction with the EU. Apparently, several campaign aides and associates of Trump even had conversations about this plan with various Russian officials, especially after candidate Trump became President-elect Trump. Mr. Trump even suggested that NATO had outlived its usefulness to the United States, must have been music to Putin's ears, and we should end our commitment to the defense of our allies in Europe by scuttling Article 5, the centerpiece of the NATO treaty. In other words, when the new president took office, he seemed poised to engineer a dramatic transformation of U.S.-Russian relations, ending in one fell swoop all the tension that post-Cold War NATO expansion had generated. Well, in brief, that hasn't happened. It's true, President Trump has steadfastly refused to criticize his Russian counterpart and has lashed out at those who do, particularly leaders of the intelligence community and members of Congress, who have warned about the magnitude of Russian interference in the last election and the likelihood that it will be repeated. Our commander-in-chief has also been notably quiet as Russia has consolidated its position in Syria and announced a new treaty, giving it access to a permanent new airbase there alongside its previously established airbase. Trump was likewise silent when Russia violated an important post-Cold War agreement with NATO by deploying more than 40,000 troops earlier this month in a massive military war game in Belarus and Western Russia, in which the troops simulated responding to a Western attack by invading the Baltic states and Poland. The president attempted to dissuade Congress from imposing new sanctions on Russia for its hacking of major portions of our electoral infrastructure. And since those sanctions were passed over Trump's objections, Mr. Trump has actually refrained from implementing them, ignoring the deadlines specified by Congress for doing that. And he has conducted several phone calls with Mr. Putin, made him twice on the sidelines of a G20 meeting. I think that's where that photo came from Merkel in Hamburg last July. But no new initiatives emerged from these contacts. In the meantime, Mr. Trump has reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to Article 5. You can all rest assured, or if any of you are Europeans, you can all rest assured. And he's no longer suggesting that it might be time to dissolve the alliance or end American participation. However, he has never issued a ringing declaration of support for our allies and has repeatedly warned that we might abandon them should they fail to increase their contribution to the collective defense. But that's just about it when it comes to a Russia policy. If, as Merriam-Webster suggests, a policy is a definite course or method of action adopted in order to guide present and future actions, Mr. Trump doesn't appear to have one. So why not? What happened to Reset 2.0? I can think of several possible answers or categories of answers. First, the president has been blocked by Congress. Certainly that's the case when it comes to lifting sanctions on the Russian Federation. Secondly, as two of my colleagues have discussed, he's been impeded by understaffing of the State Department's and cuts that he made to that organization's budget, especially in the unit responsible for overseeing sanctions, which is now down to one person. He has been dissuaded, a third possibility, for understanding the lack of policy, by the unanimous opposition of his trusted trio of generals, Mattis, McMaster, and Kelly, all of whom believe that Russia poses a serious threat to ourselves and to our allies in Europe. The president himself was another possibility, may have had second thoughts. After all, the Russians have never offered any quid pro quo, there we go, for possible US or Western concessions. And to a man who prides himself on his ability to do or redo exceptional deals to advance American interests, that can't be very attractive. Meanwhile, Russian and American positions clash sharply on two of the foreign policy issues that seem most to be engaging Mr. Trump's energy and attention: persuading North Korea to end its nuclear and long-range missile programs, and persuading Iran to negotiate or renegotiate the deal, limiting its rate of progress toward a nuclear weapon. Another possibility here is that Trump no longer has a partner in Moscow. The Russians worked very hard to elect him and defeat his opponent, but Putin seems to have concluded that Trump has become a prisoner of a hawkish, incorrigibly anti-Russian Western Washington establishment, and there's no longer any point in doing business with him. Then, finally, we come to domestic political calculations that might be impinging on Trump's activities. They provide little incentive and considerable disincentive for moving forward with a policy that Trump appeared to be formulating at the time that he took office. Trump is eager to be seen, as some of my colleagues have suggested or hinted, as undoing Obama's legacy wherever possible, and in whatever way possible. But Obama's legacy in the realm of Russia policy is mixed. Reset, after all, bears Obama's stamp and would continue to do so even if Trump called it by another name. Moreover, this is not an issue that the Trumpian base cares about. There's little or no political capital to be gained by engineering a thaw in U.S.-Russian relations. If anything, such a thaw might generate unease among his supporters, since Trump would likely to be criticized by a lot of folks for giving away the store and failing to put America first. Finally, Mr. Trump is highly vulnerable at home when it comes to the question of his approach to Russia. Any move to accommodate Moscow is likely to be interpreted as some kind of payback for the help that he received from that quarter during the election. Such a move might well be taken as evidence that Trump and his associates have been cooperating with Putin all along, i.e. colluding with him to sway the election. And the last thing Mr. Trump needs or wants is to provide ammunition to the many folks who are eager to substantiate such a case. So in conclusion, I think it could be said that Russia does pose a significant challenge or set of challenges to American interests, but we do not currently, surprise, surprise, have a policy in place to handle those challenges. And I think the prospects of such a policy emerging anytime soon are slim.
Thank you, everyone, for those, I can only say, somewhat depressing remarks. I should rename the meeting policy in a vacuum rather than fire and fury. Yeah, so I would like to could everyone who has a question just put their hand up so I know how much time I need to plan for everybody. Okay, so I see about 4 hands. Since you are first, sir, I would like to ask you to begin.
I'd like to ask Professor Metzger about this issue that seems to threaten nuclear war over North Korea. Now, most of us believe that the only option with North Korea is some kind of negotiated agreement that would reassure them that we are not intending to overthrow their government. But on the other hand, the president has been threatening military action against North Korea. Question is, with now that Mr. Xi Jinping is finished with his re-inauguration, is China prepared to do the negotiating and the arm twisting that may be necessary to get North Korea to stand down from nuclear threats?
That's the question, isn't it? Really. The thing that's interesting to note is that for all his stumbles in East Asia, President Trump, the Trump administration managed to get President Xi and the PRC to impose really harsh sanctions and even shut out economically North Korea. This is something that past administrations have been trying very hard to do and have failed to do. And it was done with remarkably little fanfare in the American press. When I heard it in the news, I was pretty stunned to hear about it. One of the things that sort of an undercurrent to that development is the whisper campaign that in exchange for getting President Xi's support for doing that President Trump may have agreed to not pay quite as much attention to the South China Sea. And that there's even a quid pro quo of some kind. I have no way of knowing whether or not that's true, but trying to make sense of how it is that President Xi agreed to make that move to further isolate North Korea economically in hopes of trying to compel them to begin to behave in a way that even China wants to see it behave. Raises a lot of questions.
Other than our passivity in the South China Sea? Is there any evidence?
Not that I've seen. I've not been able to pursue it exactly.
That's interesting.
There is